A 14-year-old boy knelt quietly on the sidewalk, drawing a red cardinal in chalk, when flashing lights and shouting officers shattered the calm. Within seconds, he was tackled, screaming as neighbors looked on in horror. His only crime? Being different. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. Chief Brooks had faced hostage-takers, armed gangs, and riots that turned city streets into war zones. But nothing prepared him for the sight of his only son curled up in fetal silence, his arms clutched tightly around his stomach like he was trying to hold himself together from the inside out. Jamie didn't look injured, no blood, no broken bones, but Daniel knew trauma when he saw it. The tremors in the boy's shoulders, the unfocused stare, the twitch of his fingers repeating the same circular motion against the grass, these were the scars no X-ray could capture. Daniel didn't speak right away. His training told him to stay calm, to assess. But the father in him boiled just beneath the surface. The responding officers, wide-eyed, stunned, stood frozen nearby, murmuring apologies and fumbling for explanations. One reached out to offer an arm, but Daniel waved him off sharply. "Don't," he said, not raising his voice, but making it clear he didn't need help. Not from them. Not now. He knelt beside Jamie slowly, lowering himself to the boy's eye level. "Buddy," he said, voice low, controlled. "You're safe now. I'm here." His hand hovered over Jamie's back for a moment before resting gently. No sudden moves, no loud words, just presence. Jamie's breathing hitched. His body stiffened, then softened at the familiar touch. The boy didn't speak, but he let out a faint, shaky exhale, a tiny signal that he was still reachable. A few feet away, the sketchbook lay abandoned, half buried in the grass. Its pages were crumpled, streaked with mud and shoe prints. Daniel reached for it, hands steady, turning the bent cover with care. The page with the red cardinal was ruined, crushed beneath what looked like a tread from a standard-issue boot. The bird, once vivid and proud, now looked like it had been trampled mid-flight. He closed the book quietly. The officers tried again, offering explanations. The call had come in as a disturbance. They thought he was unstable, possibly on drugs. The boy didn't respond to verbal commands, they said. He resisted. Protocol demanded action. Daniel turned to them. His expression was unreadable, but his jaw was locked so tight it ached. "He's nonverbal under stress," he said. "Not violent, not unstable. Autistic. You tackled a scared kid because a neighbor made a judgment call over chalk." The word chalk fell like a hammer between them. They looked away. One swallowed hard. The other adjusted his belt but said nothing, and across the street, behind a curtain, Meredith Hayes watched, arms folded, lips pursed, unmoved. Daniel's arms tightened protectively around his son as he walked past the squad car, ignoring the murmured apologies that trailed him like smoke from a distant fire. Jamie's body was limp but trembling, his cheek pressed into Daniel's shoulder, lips parted in a silent sob that never quite made it out. Daniel felt every twitch, every stifled shudder, as though his son's suffering were pulsing directly into his veins. And it was then, not in the middle of a hostage standoff or during an active shooter response, that Daniel Brooks, the most composed man in the precinct, felt something dangerously close to breaking. The house was quiet when they entered, but it was no sanctuary. Jamie flinched at the metallic click of the lock behind them. Daniel gently set him down on the couch, pulled a throw blanket over his shoulders, and knelt beside him, whispering soft words that neither needed to fully understand. Then, with measured breath and fingers that had once steadied a service pistol in firefights, he dialed Dr. Wallace, Jamie's trauma specialist. He left no dramatic voicemail, no panic in his tone, just precise, clipped sentences. "There's been an incident. He's nonverbal again. Full episode. I need help." It was only after hanging up that Daniel stood, turned toward the window, and saw her still there. Meredith Hayes, framed behind her white picketed gate like a marble statue of bureaucratic indifference. Arms crossed, mouth pursed, watching the house as if waiting for a thank you for maintaining community standards. The blood rushed to Daniel's temples, but his voice, when he stepped outside, was deadly calm. "You called the police on a child who was sitting on his own property," he said. "Drawing birds." Meredith didn't blink. "It was common sidewalk. That's public HOA domain. If we allow that, next week it's spray paint. Then someone carves their initials into the bench. Rules exist for a reason." He stared at her like she'd spoken in a foreign language. "You think what he did was vandalism?" "I think it was against code," she said flatly. "And I didn't know who he was." "You didn't ask who he was," Daniel snapped, stepping closer. "You saw something you didn't like and called it a threat. You didn't see a boy. You saw an infraction." Meredith raised her chin. "I enforce policy, not emotion." Daniel's voice dropped, low and serrated. "And I enforce justice." He turned without another word. Inside, with Jamie still curled in silence, Daniel opened his laptop. For 20 years, he'd enforced laws, protected order, but today, for the first time, he filed a formal complaint, not as a cop, but as a father. The target, the very HOA that claimed to protect the neighborhood his son no longer felt safe in. The HOA meeting room, usually half empty and filled with yawning discussions about fence heights and mailbox colors, was packed wall to wall. Folding chairs scraped against tile as neighbors shifted and whispered, eyes darting between the board table and the back wall where a local news crew adjusted their tripod. The air felt charged, like something sacred was about to be unraveled in public. Daniel Brooks sat near the center, sleeves rolled, posture calm but unshakable. Not as a uniformed chief, but as a father who had come to collect a debt. Meredith Hayes took her seat at the head of the board table like a general surveying a battlefield. Her hair was coiled into a tight bun, her HOA rulebook laid out before her like scripture. She tapped a pen once, twice, then spoke. "Let's remember this is not a trial. This is a procedural review." "No, Meredith," Daniel said, standing, his voice smooth but iron-laced. "You made it a trial the moment you treated a scared child like a criminal." A hush fell across the room. He placed a thick binder on the table, then another, and another. His tone never rose. He didn't need it to. "This is Jamie's clinical profile," he said, tapping the first binder. "Diagnosed with autism at age 3, nonverbal under acute stress, sensitive to sound, rapid movement, and strangers, which, according to your call, made him suspicious." The second binder opened with a metallic snap. "This is the body cam footage from the 2 responding officers," Daniel continued. "Note the timestamp. From approach to takedown, less than 90 seconds. No verbal engagement. No de-escalation protocol, just a misread report and a scared kid who ended up on the ground." Gasps echoed. Someone whispered, "She really called the cops on a kid?" Daniel turned a third binder toward the board. "These are written statements from residents, 14 of them so far, whose children were fined or threatened by the HOA for using chalk, putting up a lemonade stand, or hanging a rope swing. All dismissed as property violations, all families with either a disability or a single-parent household." He let the room absorb it. Then came the fourth binder. "This," Daniel said, placing it down like a final judgment, "is a full log of HOA violation reports from the past 3 years. I used public record access, because I still believe in transparency. 117 complaints under your leadership, Meredith. 84 of them against families with children or documented disabilities. That's over 72%. He looked around the room. Faces were no longer merely curious. They were stunned, angry, ashamed. Some looked at Meredith, others looked away. Daniel paused, letting the silence speak. Do you know how many of those complaints resulted in formal warnings? How many escalated to threats of liens or foreclosure? All in the name of community standards. No one answered. You thought you were enforcing rules, he said, locking eyes with Meredith. But what you did was criminalize childhood. You didn't just enforce policy. You created fear. Then his voice dropped, just enough to sharpen the edges. And this time you called the cops on the wrong kid. The street was quiet again, but the silence no longer carried the same weight. It wasn't the silence of fear or tension or the uneasy stillness that follows a storm. It was reverent, watchful, the kind of silence that bore witness, not to authority, but to healing. The concrete sidewalk in front of the Brooks home had been pressure washed weeks earlier by a neighbor who insisted it was time to start fresh. But now, as spring sunlight filtered through the budding branches above, that blank canvas came alive again. This time, not in isolation. Jamie, kneeling with chalk in one hand and his sleeve tugged nervously with the other, hesitated for a moment. Daniel stood a few feet back, arms crossed loosely, letting the boy decide. A yellow box of brand-new chalks rested beside him, unopened until now. A small note had been taped to the inside. For Jamie, so the birds can return. No name, no signature, just kindness, left like a seed in the soil. Jamie finally chose a piece, red, bold, slightly dusty. He crouched low and began to draw, slow at first, then with growing confidence. A wing, a beak, the curve of a feathered chest. The street watched. Nobody spoke. They didn't need to. Across the way, Mrs. Langford, the retired teacher who had spoken up during the hearing, stood beside her walker. Next to her, the colonel nodded once, arms folded. A teenager on a skateboard rolled quietly to a stop and sat down, watching. Even the mailman paused his route. And then it was there again. A red cardinal, perched in chalk, alive in color, unapologetically present. Daniel stepped forward and knelt beside his son. He didn't ask permission. He just opened the box, pulled out a blue stick, and began to draw. A second bird, facing the first. A quiet companion. When they were done, Jamie pressed his name in bold, blocky letters beneath the cardinal. Daniel signed his under the blue jay. Smaller, deliberate. The crowd didn't applaud. They didn't cheer. They simply stayed, as if bearing witness was enough. Later, a photo taken by a neighbor would land on the front page of the local paper. The caption would read, HOA tried to silence a boy's chalk, but didn't know his dad was the chief of police. But it was a comment posted beneath the story that captured the truth most sharply. They tried to erase a drawing. He erased their corruption. Justice hadn't come in a uniform. It hadn't come through threats or vengeance. It came through presence, through persistence, through a boy who kept drawing and a father who refused to let him be erased.